Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies Northern Saw-whet Owl webinar and the kickoff of the 2023 Levad Memorial Fund campaign. We appreciate you joining us tonight. My name is Joe Pettit, and I'm the Development Director at Bird Conservancy. I imagine a lot of you are familiar with our work, but for those of you who are new to the organization, our mission is the conservation of birds and their habitats through science, education, and land stewardship. We've advanced this mission for over 3 decades. We're headquartered here in Colorado, but we have staff in 6 states across the Western Great Plains and Eastern Rockies. Our work overall touches down in over 15 states. Tonight, we'll be honoring the legacy of Rich Levad by showcasing the 2023 Levad Fund recipient project and learning more about the species it supports, the Northern Saw-whet Owl. We're joined by author Scott Weidensaul, Northern Saw-whet Owl project lead Marion Clement, and Karen Levad. Here's Karen with a little background on Rich and his legacy.
Thank you, Joe. It is my pleasure to be here with you today and to hear more about saw-whet owls. Hi. And I'm always delighted to talk about Rich, so that it makes my heart happy. His association with the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies began while he was still a teacher in high school, but with his 3 months off during the summer, he had the opportunity to go to freely roam in the Colorado mountains. Now, he probably hesitated a little bit to confess to me that that was his new summer job. And I was skeptical. And I said, "You mean they're going to give you maps?" He loved maps. Yeah. And you get to go look at birds? Yeah. And they're going to pay you? Yeah. Wow. All right. He just smiled. I want to clarify right away that I am not a bird watcher. I am very comfortable looking up in the sky or on a lake and saying, "Oh, duck." And if I'm real confident, I might say 2 ducks. But getting down to the nitty-gritty of remembering all of the species is a challenge for me, and I just don't do it. But do you know what I do? I watch bird watchers. And over the years with my time with Richard, I got to encounter a whole slew of you all that are just fascinating and doing fascinating work. And so I am so pleased to be with you today. I did have amazing adventures and opportunities. I even have had the opportunity to hold a saw-whet owl recently banded in my hand for the few seconds before it flew off. So you can understand why I am excited about to hear from Scott and Marion about the Project Owlnet. According to their website, Owlnet, quote, seeks to optimize the cooperative nature of bird banding and facilitate easy comparison of data. Rich was all about inviting others to join him in his birding adventures and to collaborate so that new and creative strategies could be developed and implemented. He is smiling down on the work that Scott and Marion are doing. I encourage you to help support their work by contributing to the Levad Memorial Fund. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Can everybody hear me okay? We're really honored as an organization to keep Rich's legacy alive through our work through this award. My name is Marion Clement. I'm a senior avian ecologist at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. Today, it's my absolute pleasure to host this webinar with Scott Weidensaul to discuss one of my favorite owls, the Northern Saw-whet Owl. Scott, like many of us who are wildlife biologists, has made his passion his work, but unlike many of us, he's also the author of 30 books, over 30 books, including Pulitzer Prize finalist Living on the Wind. I'm sure many of you have heard of this one, as well as New York Times bestseller, A World on the Wing, which is one of my favorites. I met Scott for the first time when I was just a young biologist at a professional conference, and there I attended one of his talks, and I was not disappointed. Scott has a talent for communicating science, and his passion for birds that's just unrivaled. I kept in touch with Scott because he's also one of the co-founders of Project Owlnet that you'll hear more about today. It's a network of volunteer-run research stations that monitor this owl during its migration. Scott's been involved in this effort for over 25 years. I've been involved in more than 8 years now. I know Scott will agree with me that this is a work of love for many of us involved. Without fail, each year I just get giddy when I smell the autumn air approaching, because I know I'll get to work on Northern Saw-whet owls again. So when I joined Bird Conservancy a few years back, I saw a unique opportunity to partner with Scott and with Project Owlnet, and we began conversations to see how our organization could support this impressive grassroots research project. And just to give you a little context, when I say impressive, I mean impressive. In the last 28 years, nearly 400,000 Northern Saw-whet owls have been banded, mostly through this project's contributors. This makes it the most banded owl in North America by a landslide. And despite this incredible feat, we are somewhat limited in our ability to analyze this data. It's not currently stored in one central location that's easy to access, so it's one of the things we hope to resolve through our partnership with Project Owlnet, and we'll get into some of these details later on. But for now, I'm very excited to turn it over to Scott. And Scott, thanks again for being here with us today.
Well, Marion, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Frankly, I could have listened to Karen all evening. She is a terrific storyteller. But it's a delight to be here. It's fun to talk about also my favorite owl, the Northern Saw-whet owl. And looking at the participant list, we've got an awful lot of fellow owl banders from Project Owlnet who are joining us this evening. So a lot of people that do not have to be convinced that Northern Saw-whet owls are the coolest birds of prey in North America. I'm gonna share my screen here and hopefully everything will go okay. And well, okay, bear with me for just a moment. Because my presentation, are you seeing a title slide?
Looks
okay,
great.
Thank goodness. I thought I got deep sixed by my technology again. So there we go. I got my start banding birds back in the 1980s, working with diurnal raptors, which I thought was an awful lot of fun. I grew up near Hawk Mountain in eastern Pennsylvania, started banding hawks along the Kittatinny Ridge in the mid 1980s. That was about as much fun as I ever thought I was going to have with wild birds. But then in the mid 1990s, I discovered Northern Saw-whet owls. And if I were to tell you the story, when I tell the story of how I got involved in saw-whets, there's two versions I can tell. The version that makes me look good is that I recognized that this was an understudied species. At the time, saw-whet owls were considered a candidate species in my home state of Pennsylvania for the state endangered species list because so few of them were seen. But the fact of the matter is I was trying to impress a woman and her small daughter. And so I took them owl banding with a colleague one night. The relationship didn't last that long, but that was almost 30 years ago. And I'm still messing around with Northern Saw-whet owls at night. And also married to somebody who used to work at a banding station. So that all worked out okay. As many of you are already aware, Northern Saw-whet owls are one of the most widespread breeding raptors in North America. They breed in mixed hardwood and coniferous forests from southern Alaska to the Atlantic Maritimes. They've actually started showing up now in small numbers in Newfoundland and down through the Appalachian Mountains in the east, and of course through the mountains throughout the west, all the way down into central Mexico. To be honest, this map kind of undersells where they are in the wintertime. They certainly make it down to the Gulf of Mexico in some years. And the fact of the matter is we still don't really know how far south migratory saw-whet owls go into Mexico. As I said, they breed in primarily the boreal forest of the northern United States and Canada. And just like Marion, when the autumn winds start to blow and the temperature starts to drop in September and October and November, that's when I get very excited for saw-whet season. And even I live in New Hampshire now instead of Pennsylvania, where I spent most of my life. And so the season starts a little bit earlier up here than it did down there, but it's just as exciting no matter where I am. So as I said, this is an owl that back when I started working with saw-whets and some of my friends in the 1990s, there really was not that much known about it. Banders like Tom Erdman had started banding saw-whet owls in the 1980s up in Wisconsin and the upper Great Lakes using an audio lure, playing a recording of a male saw-whet owl's advertisement call, which dramatically increased the number of owls they caught versus the nights when they just left their nets open and saw whatever happened to fly into them. I got involved, as I said, in 1996. A couple of us in Pennsylvania, a fellow named Eric Atkinson and his wife, who at the time worked at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, another Hawk Mountain employee named Todd Bauman, who's still their director of stewardship. We started banding saw-whets and got a small grant from the State Wild Resource Conservation Fund to establish a network of saw-whet owl banding stations across Pennsylvania, including one through the Ned Smith Center for Nature and Art in central Pennsylvania, north of Harrisburg. That particular project started in 1997, and it's going ever since. I've been overseeing that almost since the beginning. We have about 20 banders on our permit, about 85 crew members. Everybody's a volunteer, including the banders. And we've banded about 13,000 saw-whet owls over the years, which sounds impressive, except that, as Marion said, there's been about 400,000 of them that have been banded overall. So we've had a fairly small percentage of that overall number. And our project there at the Ned Smith Center, we have 3 stations in eastern and central Pennsylvania, is part of this much larger network known as Project Owlnet. Marion gave me a little too much credit a moment ago when she said that I co-founded Project Owlnet. I help oversee Owlnet, but the fellow who actually founded it is my good friend Dave Brinker from Maryland Department of Natural Resources, who started Owlnet in 1994 after he'd moved from Wisconsin, where he got hooked on owl banding, to take up a job as a state wildlife biologist in Maryland. Owlnet is now a collaboration of about 125 banding stations across Canada, the United States, and even down into Mexico. And this map really does not do justice to where Owlnet is now active. And in fact, one of the partnerships we're going to have with Bird Conservancy of the Rockies with this new funding is to finally create a database that shows us exactly where all of our collaborators are. Many of them, as I said, are on the Zoom here this evening, and we're grateful for all the work that's done, in most cases entirely by volunteers on a volunteer basis, but all using shared protocols, pulling in the same direction, sharing owls back and forth, sharing information back and forth. It's a really terrific example of highly collaborative science where people just basically check their egos at the door. For those of you who are not saw-whet owl banders, in order to catch a saw-whet owl, you need mist nets, which look like your grandmother's hairnet, 40 feet long and 10 feet high, stretched in the woods at night. And then we play an audio lure that's a recording, as I said, of the vocalizations of a saw-whet owl. Most of our stations use the male advertisement call, which sounds like a garbage truck backing up. It's this mechanical tooting sound that's played at 80 or 90 decibels so that the owls that are migrating over can hear it at a great distance. After all these years, we still don't know why saw-whet owls are attracted to that call. My personal feeling is they've just never heard such a big, loud saw-whet, and they've got to take a look at it. But it also gives us an opportunity to share this research with the public. Over the years, certainly at our stations in Pennsylvania, we have, at this point, probably hosted close to 10,000 people that have come through our banding stations in the fall to get to see science up close, and also to see, the bird that I consider to be a gateway drug for conservation, because very few people are apathetic when they're shown a Northern Saw-whet owl. They are, in purely scientific terms, way cute. So of course, after we've got the bird, we have to go through a fairly simple process. We put a numbered leg band on the bird. We figure out how old the bird is, and we do that by looking at the flight feathers in the wing. The only time a bird grows all of its feathers at once is when it's a chick in the nest. And so in the fall, if we catch an owl like this, where all of those flight feathers are smooth and glossy and shiny and fresh, we know this is what we call a hatching year bird, a bird that was just born that summer. On the other hand, as the birds get older over the course of the next 3 or 4 years, they lose and replace their flight feathers in a fairly predictable pattern. And it can sometimes be a little bit hard to see where, which feathers are new and which are old, except for the fact that owls glow in the dark. Saw-whet owls, like almost all species of owls, pigment their feathers with a pigment known as porphyrins, and porphyrins fluoresce under ultraviolet light. So when you turn out the lights and turn on a black light, this is what you see. So you can see a bunch of new feathers there in the outer part of the wing that are glowing and fluorescing brilliantly. You can see some very old feathers that aren't glowing much at all because they're at least 3 years old. This is a bird that's at least 3 years old, what we call an after second year bird. So this is an example of both serious ornithology and kind of a cheap party trick, because I have never gotten tired of turning off the lights and not wanting people and turning on the black light and listening to them gasp. And you may have been paying attention, the last couple of years, there's been a lot of press about how science has discovered that many species of vertebrates, from amphibians to mammals like flying squirrels and platypuses, to even the beaks of puffins, fluoresce under ultraviolet light. Which ticks me off, though, is that we almost never get credit for the fact that owls were among the first group that this was recognized in. And it had nothing to do with me. It was a fellow named Bruce Colvin who was studying rats and barn owls and their interactions for his graduate studies in the 1980s in Ohio, who figured out almost by accident that owls fluoresce in the dark, and it was an easy way to age the birds. One of the things we've seen over the course of the 26 years or so that we've been working with saw-whet owls in Pennsylvania is how incredibly cyclical their populations are. How they have this sort of boom and bust population cycles at roughly 4-year intervals, although it's a somewhat irregular cycle. In big years like 2007, 2012, we're just buried in owls. In low years, like the years immediately following those big years, we invest a lot of time in jigsaw puzzles at our banding stations. And the reason for these huge swings all comes down to food, and two different trophic levels of food. It starts with cone crops in eastern Canada. I'm speaking here about our stations in eastern North America at this point. About every 4 years or so, we get a population spike in, oops, I'm not really sure what, there we go. We get a population spike in the populations of small mammals like redback voles. And those population spikes are driven by heavy cone crops in the spruce and fir forests of Canada. All of those voles mean lots of food for saw-whet owls. I'm really not sure what that little red line is. I don't think I did that. This is a juvenile saw-whet owl in its juvenile plumage, which they lose before they start their fall migration. Saw-whet owls can lay anywhere up to 13 eggs in a really good year when there's a lot of food available. And in fact, in a really big year, a female may start one nest with one male, lay a bunch of eggs, abandon the chicks before they're fully grown, go off with another male and start a second nest. And so when you get a boom year with lots and lots of rodents, you can get an enormous surge in saw-whet population. So almost all of those big surges we see in heavy years are almost entirely young owls. This is what a good year looks like. This was fall of 2012. That's a single hour's net check at one of our stations. That year, between our 3 regular stations and 6 experimental stations that we sent up, we caught almost 4,000 saw-whet owls. It was really an extraordinary year. We learn a lot by banding, and because there are so many stations out there that are banding saw-whet owls, we trade owls back and forth. If you talk to a songbird bander, a recovery rate of less than 1% is typical for banded songbirds. Very, very few banded songbirds are ever encountered again, either found dead or caught by another banding station. On the other hand, with saw-whet owls, probably about, I'd say somewhere around 14 or 15% of the owls we band are recaptured or encountered again, and we capture about that same percentage of previously banded birds at our banding station. But you can only learn so much from banding. There are other techniques that you can use that can open up a window onto the lives of these very secretive birds. For example, during the early to mid 2000s, we spent a lot of time using standard VHF radio telemetry, where we were putting these small, roughly 2-gram transmitters on saw-whet owls using a backpack harness, and studying them to find out a little bit more about their roost behavior. We're interested in what these birds were doing when they were not actively migrating. Our project does not have an air force, and so there's no way we can actually follow these owls in active migration through mountainous terrain. So what we were able to do is, I have no idea why all kinds of stuff is scribbling over the screen here. Tyler, if you can help me out, that would be helpful. I think somebody must be doing that with their computer. That's not me on this end. In any event, we were studying their stopover ecology, looking at what kind of habitat they were using for their nocturnal roosts, and also doing nighttime telemetry, triangulation telemetry, where we were tracking these birds all night, every night from dusk until dawn, and trying to figure out how much territory they were using. What you see here is a map of the movements of a single owl at a state forest in south central Pennsylvania over the course of a couple of weeks. Each of these colored polygons represents a different night's activity. This tiny bird that's about the size of a soda can was using about 1,500 acres. We had no idea that such a small bird were using such large areas. We were also the first group in the world to use what were then newly developed light-sensitive geolocators to try to understand the movements of Northern Saw-whet owls. And we deployed, this is in the fall of 2009. Thank you very much, Tyler. We deployed about 250 of these. Now, these are not transmitters. They're not sending out any kind of a signal. They're data loggers. And the idea is they're constantly recording light levels. And when the owl is recaptured at a later date, you can download the data, and at a very rough, plus or minus about 100 kilometers, tell where this bird was. The trick is you got to get the bird back. And we figured that with the number of owl banding stations that were out there, we'd have a pretty good recovery rate. Well, we got about half a dozen or so of these geolocators back. Some of them, unfortunately, had failed. It was a fairly new technology, and it doesn't always work. A couple of them were recovered within the same migration season, which didn't really tell us all that much. But one was recaptured after about 3 years. And actually, the bander who recaptured that bird is on tonight's call. I'm looking at you, Claire, and still very grateful for that. The 2-year battery on this thing was still functioning after 3 years. So sometimes the technology does more than it's supposed to do. And it really opened our eyes to how saw-whet owls just have not read the rule book that other owls and other birds go by. Most birds return to the same place every year to breed and return to roughly the same place every year after their migration to spend the winter. Saw-whet owls don't do this. This bird was banded in Pennsylvania. Some years it wintered as far south as Western Virginia. Some years it wintered as far north as the Adirondacks in upstate New York. It nested as far north as Quebec in some years and as far south as Western Maryland and Pennsylvania in other years. Saw-whet owls are really unusual in the fact that they are highly nomadic and really don't follow the playbook that most other birds do. Some of the Project Owlnet collaborating sites have been doing this for a long time. And 3 years ago now, we were able to take data from about 7 of our long-running sites in Canada and the northeastern United States and do a trend analysis on populations in Northern Saw-whet owls. Because these stations are all doing what's known as constant effort mist netting, where we're using the same number of mist nets in the same place for the same number of nights, not changing anything in the way we operate the station from year to year. As the number of owls that we catch goes up and down, that probably reflects overall populations. And so we did an analysis on how populations have changed over the course of the last 25 years or so. And we found that at least in the East, based on our data, populations of Northern Saw-whet owls appear to be fairly stable. There may have been a small, statistically insignificant decline in recent years, but for the most part, they seem to be doing pretty well. Now, of course, we'd love to know how saw-whet owls are doing elsewhere in their range across North America, but unfortunately, we don't have the same level of multiple long-term data sets in most other parts of their range in order to do that analysis. The other advantage to having that kind of long-term data set is we can look at how the timing of migration has changed, the phenology of migration, when whether climate change, for example, is changing the migration timing. And one of the things that we have found and this is a paper that's going to be published shortly in the Wilson Journal of Ornithology, is that indeed the peak migration in eastern United States for northern saw-whet owls has been shifting backwards by about a day a year for the last couple of decades. Interestingly, that's about the same rate that the migration of diurnal raptors like hawks and falcons has also been shifting backwards, also probably because of climate change and warming temperatures. Back in 2012, Dave Brinker and I took a chance on a new technology. It was then a fairly new technology, what was known as nanotag technology. This is another form of VHF radio technology, but instead of having to dial through a whole bunch of different frequencies, in the old days, if we were tracking saw-whet owls, we might have 5 saw-whet owls out there and have 5 different frequencies. You have to keep plugging in a frequency and finding that owl, plug in a new frequency and find that owl. These nanotags all operate on the same frequency, about 166 megahertz, but they broadcast a unique identification code so that you can tell each individual bird that was tagged by its identification code. And so in the fall of 2012, we set up 4 automated receiver stations. So we didn't have to run around in the middle of the night and actually track these owls ourselves in South Central Pennsylvania with the idea of trying to understand the movements of saw-whets through that part of the world. It was really successful. We learned a lot, but we also learned that Birds Canada, what in those days was known as Bird Studies Canada, had this brilliant idea of taking this technology and building out what they hope to be eventually would be a global system for tracking migratory birds and bats and insects, what they called the MODIS wildlife tracking system. MODIS comes from the Latin word meaning movement. And MODIS has been phenomenally successful. This is, if you go to www.modis.org, you can learn a little bit more about this. There are now about 1,600 of these automated receiver stations all around the world. As you can see, most dense in Eastern North America, although that is changing very, very rapidly. The Bird Conservancy of the Rockies is very involved in MODIS work. There's just an explosion of MODIS expansion going on in the Western United States. I got involved along with Dave Brinker and some colleagues in what we call the Northeast MODIS collaboration in 2017, specifically to try to build out an interior Northeastern MODIS network so we could track northern saw-whet owls. Because there's questions that we have just not been able to answer about saw-whets, despite all the banding we've done and all the other work. For example, where are the males? Where are the adult males? Almost all of the saw-whets we catch, probably 75% or so, are females. The relatively small number of males we catch are almost always juvenile males, hatch year males on their first migration. In our 26 years of banding saw-whets in Pennsylvania, 13,000 saw-whets, we have caught exactly 12 fully adult males, so fewer than 1 in 1,000. We think the adult males are remaining up in the breeding grounds in the northern US and Canada, just shifting their territories to find the places that have the highest rodent populations without really migrating, but we don't know. And we think that MODIS is going to help us start to answer those questions. And so in the coming years, you're going to see a lot more attention being paid to tracking northern saw-whet owls. For example, we have a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service grant, and we're going to be tagging about 250 saw-whet owls in the Northeast and East and Upper Great Lakes in late 2024 and 2025, as soon as we build out a bit more of a robust network in the Southern Appalachians and across the South to track the birds in those eastern flyways as they head south. And there'll be tremendous opportunities in the years to come to do the same thing across their range in the West. Just to give you an idea, and this is not a saw-whet owl animation, but this gives you a sense of the power of MODIS. This is an animation showing the migration of dozens and dozens of tagged Swainson's thrushes last fall as they move south through North America through this MODIS network. And it's like watching a meteor shower. And you occasionally see one going the wrong way. Those are probably transmitters that were being mailed from one person to another, and they were on and they were transmitting when they weren't supposed to. But nevertheless, this gives us a phenomenally rich look at the migration of birds like saw-whet owls that have always been too small to put satellite transmitters on or things of that sort. We've been doing this for a long time. I never get tired of seeing, I get as excited at each new saw-whet owl that I see as I did at the first one. And come on, look at that face. How could you not get excited about working like with an owl like that? It's been a privilege to work so closely and so intimately with these birds this year, and over the years. And it's also been a real privilege to work with so many other passionate, committed, excited, and as I said, highly collaborative scientists and banders and others around the country, people like Marion. And at this point, I think I'm going to turn things over to Marion. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And gee, if you want to talk saw-whet owls, we can keep talking saw-whet owls.
Let's keep talking saw-whet owls.
Let's keep talking saw-whet owls.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that talk, Scott, and I particularly enjoyed hearing how such a tiny owl had such a large impact on your personal life as well. I didn't know that about you, so that's great. What we're going to do next is I'm going to follow up with a couple of guided questions before we open it up to audience questions as well. One of the main questions that I wanted to ask you, just based on hearing you talk about transmitters and how technology is advancing, I'm curious if you can kind of highlight why this owl has been particularly challenging to use our advancement in technology on. So, for example, transmitters now, like I'm thinking about remote loggers, can be deployed on something as small as a dragonfly. So why not saw-whets? What's the hiccup?
Well, they can, and I've done a lot of work using data loggers on other birds. I have a research project in collaboration with the National Park Service in Alaska, where we're studying thrush and warbler and sparrow migration from Denali National Park, and we've used data loggers like pinpoint GPS tags and geolocators. Because those birds tend to come predictably back to their breeding sites, I can catch a black-polled warbler in the Hogan Creek watershed in Denali National Park this year and deploy a geolocator on it and go back to that watershed next year and be reasonably sure that if that bird survived, it's going to be somewhere in that area. And so over the years, we usually get 40 to 50% of the individuals that we've tagged that we're able to recapture in subsequent years. Well, as you saw from that map, from that one geolocator we got back from the saw-whets don't do that. They're all over the map. And so, any technology like a geolocator or a data logger that requires you to recapture the bird is kind of a non-starter. I mean, there are satellite transmitters that you can use, and they've always been a little too big for saw-whets. Saw-whets, females average somewhere between 80 and 100 grams. If you really don't want to put anything on the bird that is going to weigh more than about 3% of its body weight. And the smallest satellite transmitters that are not solar powered, because after all, we're talking about an owl here, are usually about 4 or 5 grams. So they're just a little too heavy for them. So yeah, we've sort of been in this, in this nebulous gray zone where it's been really hard to find a technology that's going to work to allow us to track these birds. And that's why I've been really excited about nanotags, because as you say, some of these, they're small enough to put them on dragonflies or monarch butterflies. Now, the batteries don't last very long at that size, but we can put, a 2.5 gram transmitter on a saw-whet owl, a nanotag transmitter, with a battery that's probably going to last about 2.5 years. And so we can get theoretically multiple migration cycles out of that bird. What we need is a robust receiver network to be able to pick up those birds as they're moving, because if they don't go past one of those antennas, one of those receiver stations, we don't pick them up. So, we've actually, at Project Owlnet, we've been sitting on a significant grant that we received in 2013 from a very generous donor who has long since passed on to his reward, that we've been hanging on to till we had enough of a MODIS network in the East to be able to make it worthwhile to tag a large number of Northern Saw-whet owls. And we're going to finally be using that generous gift over the next couple of years to tag hundreds and hundreds of saw-whets in collaboration with other folks in Project Owlnet.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. I mean, there's so much still that we have to learn about Northern Saw-whet owls just because of how small and nomadic they are. I mean, there's only so much that you can learn from banding data. It's only point A, point B, maybe point C if you're really, really lucky. But that's super rare. And just for those people that are tuned in today that maybe aren't quite as familiar as, you know, with banding and how that works, you know, most of the times, if we're lucky, we get a 3% recovery rate in terms of, you know, freeing a bird that's been banded and just hoping that by chance someone else is going to catch it. So when you're talking about really expensive transmitter technology that can be up to $1,000, and then, you know, putting that very expensive transmitter on a bird that you have a 3% chance of recovering, you know, it's making way too expensive of a bet that you're probably not going to get data for. So I think MODIS is going to be the key until technology kind of catches up and becomes lighter and lighter, for cellular transmitters, for example. That's very exciting. And, you know, Bird Conservancy is very active, very proactive in filling some of the spatial gaps in terms of coverage that we have in the West, and even with our partners down in Mexico. So we're hoping to also put some transmitters in the future on Northern Saw-whets and see how our birds behave differently than the East Coast birds. But yeah, very exciting work. All right. Up next, I just wanted to ask you a fun question. Can you tell me if you have a particularly memorable, whether that's enjoyable or frightening story about Northern Saw-whet owl banding that you'd like to share?
Well, enjoyable. Any evening I get to see somebody see their first saw-whet owl.
Yeah.
I feel like Merlin the magician whenever I do that. Frightening, I certainly alarming. One of the first years that we were banding in Pennsylvania, so this would have been probably maybe 1998, 1999. We were using mist nets that were manufactured by a company in Europe, and they were inexpensive. But the problem we found here in the humid East is that at night, when the humidity came up, the nets absorbed a lot of moisture and they sagged, and they'd sag right down to the ground. And we were closing the nets on this really warm early October night, well after midnight. And we found that a 4-foot-long eastern timber rattlesnake had crawled through one of these sagging nets, which wouldn't have been a problem except it had eaten something recently. So it had this bulge in the middle and it got stuck halfway. And of course, rattlesnakes have very coarse scales, and so it couldn't back up. It couldn't go forward. And I had just given my new volunteers the "thou shalt not cut the net" speech. And I saw this thing, you know, sort of writhing in the net. And somebody said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to cut the net. What do you think I'm going to do? We're, you know, in the middle of the night, 5 miles of dirt road from the nearest hardtop and 40 minutes from the nearest hospital. I'm not going to do anything stupid." Fortunately, timber rattlesnakes are pretty mellow snakes, especially compared to prairie rattlesnakes. And so we taped a knife to the end of a stick and we popped a couple of strands in the net, and it slid off and went. Never rattled, never struck. It was just, like I said, timber rattlesnakes are kind of mellow. I'm cool with snakes. I was a herp nut before I was a bird nut anyway, so that was kind of a high point for me.
Birds and herps are kind of the same thing anyway.
They're
both pretty close to dinosaurs. Yeah, that sounds pretty spooky. I've never had that experience, so that was good thinking about the knife on a stick.
Well, yeah, that was I did stupid things with venomous snakes when I was in high school and college, and I got older and wiser. I'm not messing around with them like that anymore. I'm not bare-handing rattlesnakes.
Yeah, good. So, you know, for being North America's most banded owl, when you start to do some research on Northern Saw-whet owls, there's just so much that we don't know. Mm-hmm. And that's the case for a lot of small owls, just because it's difficult to study them, but it's especially the case for Northern Saw-whet owls. In your opinion, what's the highest research priority for this species? Is there something we really need to hone in on in future research?
Well, there's a couple of things. Where the males are, that's a really big question, because that's, you know, kind of an important gender to know what they're doing. I would also love to know more about juvenile survival rates and juvenile dispersal. We know this is a fairly short-lived owl. Based on banding records, probably the average lifespan is about 3.5 years. Compare that to, maybe 8 to 10 years for a great horned owl. They live fast, breed hard, and die young, basically. But in order to model populations for any species, you need to know all the demographics: adult survival rate, longevity, juvenile survival rate. And we don't have that for Northern Saw-whet owls, and we don't have that for a fair number of species of owls. So that's one area that I think is important. It would really be great to have the kind of trend data elsewhere in their range that we have for the East. I mean, I don't want to get too complacent saying that saw-whet owl populations appear to be stable in the East. That's a small slice of where the species is found. And, it's entirely possible that other parts of their range are under significant threat from things like climate change and, bark beetle spread in conifer forests in the West, which is not so much an issue in eastern forests, but is definitely a serious issue in many parts of the West where saw-whets breed. The montane populations, especially at more southerly latitudes, the populations down in the mountains of Southern California and down into Mexico, how are they faring in a rapidly changing climate? So there's, it's not like we're going to run out of things to study here with saw-whets, but we have a whole host of new techniques that are being brought to bear on studying birds and bird migration and bird demography in general, things like stable isotopes and genetics, the genetic structure of different populations. And for the most part, these are not techniques that have been applied to saw-whets, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there to start to use these kind of emerging technologies and techniques.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm glad you mentioned climate, just because, despite our very limited understanding of this species, there's been some climate models out there that are projecting a pretty, dire picture of what their breeding range is going to look like. I mean, you can confirm this or elaborate on this, but this is a cold adapted species mostly, that's heat sensitive. And so I could imagine its breeding range being somewhat limited in the future if trends continue. Would you agree with that?
I would. And I mean, somebody might look at that map and say, well, geez, they breed all the way down into tropical Mexico, but they're breeding at very high elevations in Mexico, up in these very high elevation oak and pine forests that are somewhat similar in climate to, temperate North America. I've been in some of those high elevation oak and pine forests in Mexico, and I have frozen my butt off at night. It gets down into the 30s in some of those places. So yeah, this is a bird. So, especially populations, as I said, places like the Southern Appalachians, in the Great Smokies, and, in North Carolina and Tennessee, they've gone as high as they can go. And as the climate warms and plant communities change and temperatures rise, we may start to see those isolated and perhaps genetically unique populations starting to wink out. Here again, that's a great area for, I think, additional genetic research, so we better understand the genetics of this bird. There's been some recent work on sort of population level genetics in saw-whets that seems to suggest that there's not a lot of geographic variation, probably because there's so much of this back and forth. There's a very unique subspecies that's found. Very unique. I'm a writer. I shouldn't modify unique like that. There's a unique subspecies that's found on Haida Gwaii, the big island chain off the coast of British Columbia, that may actually even rank as a separate species of saw-whet. But nevertheless, even if it doesn't rise to the level of subspecies, these geographically disjunct populations like those in the Southern Appalachians probably deserve a lot more attention.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. And I think a lot of us who are collaborating on this project are particularly interested in that topic, just because, like, you love to say that saw-whet owls are gateway conservation, or gateway drug to conservation. And I love that. And like, one of the things that I like to say about saw-whets is that they're little agents of chaos, because Raptors and owls in general are either very territorial, where they kind of stay in the general area year round, or they're migratory. And saw-whets just don't really fit that mold. They kind of randomly wander around and do different things every year. And so maybe they'll be really well off in the future to adapt to changing conditions, just because they're kind of like random and adaptive, but maybe that's making them more susceptible too. So I think, yeah, we're sitting on this gold mine of data at Project Owlnet, and it'll be really fascinating to see what we can do with it in the future. As I kind of wrap up, we only have 2 minutes, and then we're going to transition over to something else. But I did want to quickly check in with you. Is there something that non-scientists can do to help this species persist? What, in your opinion, is something someone can do just to encourage these adorable little owls in their backyard?
Well, if in terms of attracting them in the non-breeding season, just having a lot of structure in your yard, if you're anywhere in their wintering range, birders often talk about looking for saw-whet owl habitat, and they usually mean like thick conifers. I've tracked a lot of saw-whets with radio transmitters, and I've come to believe there's no such thing as saw-whet habitat. There's only saw-whet structure. They like really dense, really thick structure, especially evergreen structure in the wintertime, but in the summertime, actually, before the leaves drop here in the Northeast, they roost mostly in large hardwood trees, out in the outer branches and kind of up in the leaves of large hardwood trees. But I've seen them roosting on the ground in mountain laurel and rhododendron thickets, 80 feet up in pine trees, in old blowdowns. As far as attracting them in the breeding season, they're cavity nesters, and it's entirely possible that they are somewhat limited by the availability of natural cavities. However, I would say there's some fairly recent research out of Pennsylvania where folks were running nest boxes for Northern Saw-whet owls in northwestern Pennsylvania. And they found that predators, the first year or two they put the boxes up, they were really good for the saw-whet owls. But after that, predators really figured out where the boxes were and started targeting those boxes. And so I would say, if you're putting up a nest box for any species of owl, be it a saw-whet or a western screech owl or a ferruginous owl or whatever, or a flammulated owl or whatever, make sure that you put up a predator guard on the tree to keep climbing predators like fishers and other predators, raccoons and such, out of those boxes, because otherwise all you may be doing is attracting an owl to nest in a spot that the predator already knows about and is going to come back and nosh on eggs or chicks later.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. Before we jump into audience questions, I do want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about our partnership goals with Project Owlnet.
Please.
We're really excited to share some of the work that we'll be doing. So I'll just jump in. Can you see my screen, Scott?
Yep.
Perfect. So I just want to take a moment to discuss what we envision for the future, just because Bird Conservancy is very eager to support this grassroots project. Our first goal is really simple and almost separate from our partnership goals. We want to contribute, right? So Bird Conservancy is working towards establishing a permanent Fort Collins station right near our office. There is a very limited amount of data coming out of Western states, and I'm not talking about Pacific Coast states necessarily, but the Intermountain West has only contributed 6% of all the banding data on Northern Saw-whet owls since the 60s, and Colorado itself as a state only 0.3%. So there's a big information gap there, and the Front Range is a particularly interesting area. It's undergoing development. It could also be an important migration corridor just because it's the edge of the mountain and the prairie. So we're excited to contribute to this gold mine of data into the future. Oops, let me move forward. Hello. Our second partnership is what we're going to be actively working on in the next 2 years. We are really excited to have gotten a grant from Tracy Aviary to do this work. We're hoping to partner with Project Owlnet and have a lot of conversations with contributors about what the project's needs are. But the main goal that we have is to create a centralized data repository so that rather than being stored by individual stations, we have effort data that can be used to scale banding data as well, to start to get to some trends analyses that are outside of the East Coast and see how the species is doing elsewhere. The project itself also needs some help in terms of continuing to update where its collaborators are located. And I just can't wait to have this dynamic map of just little dots pointing at, popping up everywhere, because there's been a very large increase in number of contributors over the years. And we need to keep better track of that as a project. So we want to archive, safeguard data, and make sure that it's actually being used in robust analyses in the future. And then, sorry, it's slow to change. And then lastly, and this is a couple years down the line, our organization is excited to partner with Project Owlnet contributors as well to try to produce the first range-wide estimates as well as regional estimates that are outside of the East Coast, just to see how the species is doing elsewhere. The figure on the right is actually from Dave Brinker, who the audience has heard his name a few times already, and he's a mentor and a good friend of mine as well. And Dave has been running a consistent banding effort on Assateague Island in Maryland since the 90s. And as you can see from this figure, although the general number of owls doesn't seem to be declining, the abundance of those eruption years, so when Scott kind of talked about this boom and bust cycle, seems to be declining. And that's a really important part of this species survival in the long term. And so we're curious to see if that is happening elsewhere. And we have all this amazing data, so we need to start to get to work on analyzing it. So we're hoping to facilitate that with other collaborators. So of course, to implement these conservation goals, we need time, we need people, and that also means that we need money. So we're very fortunate to have received a competitive grant through Tracy Aviary. If you're not familiar with Tracy Aviary, I encourage you to look them up. They have a conservation grant for researchers. And so we were able to secure about $10,000 for this project. And in order to implement some of our goals, we need to raise an additional $10,000 more. So we're very fortunate that a couple of very generous individuals have already donated to the project. We're now at $3,000, but we are still hoping to raise this year an additional $7,000. So really anything that you want to give to this project will really help our goals. And so please, share this with your neighbors, with your friends, heck, share it with your grandma, your kids. Anything will help us to get to this goal. And Joe is going to send a link to registered participants at the end of this webinar. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Amy for audience questions. Thank you.
Thanks again, Scott. We have some questions for you in the chat. We are going to, I'll try to keep them, try to pick the short ones, I think. The first one is, when a female leaves a nest of young to start another nest, do the young in the first nest survive? Does the male continue the care?
Yeah, he does. And this only happens in years when there's one of these vole peaks, when there's just a lot of food available. So a single parent is, generally able to bring those chicks off to fledging. I don't want to make it sound like that's really common. We know it happens occasionally. But, when you have one of these, plague years, when there are just, and we just went through one here in New Hampshire 2 years ago, it seemed like there were redback voles everywhere. It's really easy for a single parent to provide enough food to bring those chicks off.
Thank you. That's interesting. What is the oldest recorded age of a saw-whet owl, and from where?
Well, I can tell you that last year in Pennsylvania, we caught one that was, if the band numbers were read correctly, was about 14 years old. And I trust the bander. It was my most experienced and I don't want to say oldest, but of longest serving site coordinator that was actually the bander that evening. I have no doubt that they read the band number correctly. Unfortunately, we did not take a picture of the band number because we catch foreign owls all the time, so we normally don't do that. And without that photographic proof, I'm actually not sure the banding lab is going to accept the record. Beyond that, I'm just going off the top of my head here. I think the nearest longevity record beyond that is about 9 years. I don't have that right off the top of my head, but as I said, the average is more like about 3.5.
Okay. Jolyn is asking, are there any banding stations in southern Colorado? And I'm assuming she means banding in Motus or Motus.
Marion, you're gonna have to answer if there's any owl banding stations in that part of Colorado. I'm not.
Southern
Yeah,
Colorado.
oh, is someone else about to jump in and say something? I'm not familiar with any in southern Colorado. I know of an individual banding in Estes Park, and that's about it.
Right.
But that's going to be the magic of creating a way for people to, check in so that we can figure out where exactly our collaborators are. Because right now we have a project listserv, and so it's really just about seeing what names come through and where their station is located if they choose to say that. So we don't always know where our people are located.
And if the person was asking about Motus stations, if you go to motus.org, all those little yellow dots on that map that I showed you, you can click on any of those. You can zoom in, see if there's a Motus station near you in Colorado or elsewhere, and click on the button, click on the little dot, and it will pop up and give you all the information on this station. You can see what birds and bats and insects have been tracked there. You can actually generate maps for any of those animals to see where they've gone. It's pretty addictive stuff.
Thank you. Do you see carbon isotope mapping from feather samples as a useful tool for understanding saw-whet movement in addition to the Motus network?
Yeah, that's something I mentioned before, using isotopes and some of these other, sort of emerging technologies. For those who aren't familiar with this, when a bird is growing its feathers, there are basically different flavors of different elements like carbon and sulfur and there's a deuterium, there's a whole bunch of them that tell you different things about either where the bird came from, where it was when it was growing that feather, or whether it's feeding in a terrestrial or marine environment. There's a lot of different things that you can do with stable chemical isotopes, and by overlaying banding data and isotopic data and genetic data, we're building these really rich pictures of where different regional populations of birds are coming from, where they're going for the winter, what migration routes they're using, just layering all these different kinds of data together that are giving us insights into migratory birds that we didn't have even just 10 years ago.
Yeah, and I'll just jump right in and say that if anyone is on here who's a collaborator, I am working with a couple of other collaborators right now to run some analyses for the Intermountain West. So if you're located in those states and you want to reach out to me, we're hoping to pull some feathers and do that analysis in the next few years.
Oh, that's fantastic news.
Mary Freeman asks, have you reached out to Northern Canada, if any, banders, to learn of the status of male Northern Saw-whet owls, since a lot of California's forests have been burned?
So, yeah, given the fires that are going on in Canada right now, that's obviously, I would imagine, going to have an impact on saw-whet populations. Although last week I was teaching a field ornithology course in Pennsylvania, and 4 of our participants were from indigenous communities in Manitoba and Quebec. And in fact, one of the participants, her community was under an evacuation order because of one of the wildfires. And the point she made was indigenous communities and the wildlife of boreal forests have been living with fire for a very, very long time. The intensity of the fires are certainly increasing, but fire is part of the natural system in boreal forests. Interestingly, in the last, I'd say maybe 3 weeks or so, at our MODA stations in the Northeast, we've seen that chimney swifts that were tagged in previous years on their breeding grounds in Quebec and which had migrated north into Quebec in the spring, like they always do, have come back south again into Vermont and New Hampshire, presumably because of smoke and fire up there. And we don't know, this may be something that birds do regularly in the face of fire that we've just never noticed before because we had no way of tracking them. So I think there's a lot that we have to learn about how these large-scale fires are affecting breeding birds up in the boreal forest.
Yeah, another part of my work at Bird Conservancy is working on spotted owls, and they're a little bit more constrained than saw-whets, obviously threatened species. But for them, wildfire intensity and the scale of the wildfires is actually, even though they're fire adapted, it's a big threat because we actually, you know, sometimes we think about birds, we're like, they can fly away, they're very mobile, but a lot of times, especially if they're breeding, they end up wanting to sit on the nest for way too long. And then after that, it's a little too late, and we end up finding casualties a lot after wildfires. Not necessarily because, you know, they stayed put, but they just get dazed and confused by the smoke and then they end up perishing. So I think there's a limit to everything. And yeah, hopefully, you know, the saw-whets are doing okay up there.
The one last question, is there from Sue, she asks, is there a southern saw-whet owl?
There is an unspotted saw-whet owl that's found in the mountains of Central America. It is even less known than the northern saw-whet owl. And it is, I haven't seen one, and that is an absolute bucket list bird for me. There's also another member of the genus Ajoleus called the buff-fronted owl that's found in high elevations in the Andes in South America. That it looks like kind of a caramel-colored saw-whet owl, but it's very obviously a close relative of the saw-whet.
Thank you so much. That wraps up the end of the Q&A portion. I'd like to pass it over to Joe Pettit for closing remarks.
Thanks, Amy. That was absolutely amazing. I really learned a lot during that. So thank you so much to Scott and Marion. And thank you to Karen, and Karen, to your family for your partnership and helping us carry on Rich's legacy. It's really important to Bird Conservancy. And finally, thanks to everyone that joined us tonight. We hope you had a great time, learned something new about Bird Conservancy and the Northern Saw-whet Owl. And of course, I encourage you to support the 2023 Levad Memorial Fund and Marion's incredible project. You'll see us, we provide the link to donate in the chat. We'll also be sending an email to everyone tomorrow with more info on the project, as well as links to donate. And yeah, that's the end of the night for us. Again, thank you so much for all your support and for everything you do for birds. Have a great evening.
That went by so fast.
It did. Thank you so much, everybody.